She called me trash on my own land. Standing on a private road my grandfather built by hand in 1947, surrounded by pasture that has carried the Denton name for 3 generations, this woman in a luxury SUV looked at me, looked at my cattle, looked at the fence posts my father replaced when I was 9 years old, and said the words loud enough for both of us to hear clearly above the engine noise. Then she drove off through my gate like it wasn't there. I stood in the settling dust with the particular stillness that comes over a man when something has shifted permanently. Not the anger. I'd had anger for 4 months. This was past that. This was the cold, clear recognition that polite warnings had run their course and something structural needed to happen. That night I called a contractor I had worked with for 20 years. I told him I needed something built, something that would still be standing after both Sandra Whitfield and I were long gone. Something engineered to a standard that a BMW traveling at 30 miles per hour would learn a lesson from. He asked me what I had in mind. I told him, permanent. Tell me where you're watching from. Then stay with me, because what I'm about to describe is the most satisfying construction project I have ever funded in 61 years of living on Texas land. And the story of what it cost, and what it cost Sandra, is something I think you need to hear. My name is Cole Denton. I'm 61 years old, semi-retired from cattle ranching and the 3rd generation to work the same 57 acres outside of Clearwater, Texas. My grandfather Herschel Denton bought this land in 1945 with money he had saved during the war and a determination to build something that would outlast him. He managed that on both counts. My wife Loretta taught elementary school for 23 years before her knee made standing all day impossible. We raised 2 sons here who are now raising their own children in cities. We have buried my grandfather, my grandmother, and my father on the northeast corner of the property overlooking the creek, under a stand of old pecan trees that were already mature when Herschel arrived. On evenings when the light is right, I walk up there and have conversations with them, the way you do when you've known people long enough that their absence still feels like a presence. The ranch road runs a 1/4 mile from the county highway through my main pasture to the house. Herschel built it in 1947 with a borrowed grader and whatever cliché he could haul. The deed describes it as private. The signs describe it as private. The gate at the county road entrance describes it as private in letters visible from a reasonable distance at highway speeds. None of this information reached Sandra Whitfield, or, if it did, she filed it in the category of things that applied to other people. Sandra moved to Creekwood Ranch Estates 14 months ago. She came from Houston, drove a white Lexus GX that she replaced 3 months after arrival with an even newer white Lexus GX, and within 6 months had positioned herself as HOA president through a combination of energy, persistence, and the particular skill of making other people feel that disagreeing with her was socially expensive. She was 54, recently divorced, working as a real estate agent, and operating with the specific momentum of someone who has decided to reinvent herself and has not yet encountered the limits of that project. My ranch road cut 3 minutes off her drive to the highway. She discovered this approximately 2 weeks after moving in and began using it approximately 1 week after that. The first time I saw her drive through, I assumed it was a mistake. People miss turns. I walked to the gate and confirmed the latch was still functioning and went back to what I was doing. The second time I was at the fence line close enough to make eye contact. She slowed, acknowledged me with the minimal nod of someone who knows they are being observed, and kept moving. I walked to her car. She powered down her window with the expression of someone performing patience. I introduced myself. I explained that the road was private property, that it was on the deed, and that I would appreciate her using the public road for her route. I was as direct and as civil as I knew how to be. My grandmother raised me with the understanding that courtesy costs nothing and communicates confidence. Sandra smiled. It was the kind of smile that is designed to make the recipient feel unreasonable for having raised the subject. She said something about the road having been used by area residents for years. She said she understood I had concerns, but that established access patterns created community rights. She mentioned that she was on the HOA board and would be happy to look into the formal status of the road. I told her the formal status was documented in the county deed records, and that I would be sending a certified letter to the HOA outlining the property boundaries. She said, "Bless your heart," and drove off. Any Texan reading this knows what those 3 words mean when delivered in that register. The conversation was over. The decision had been made. She was going to keep using my road until someone made it impossible to do so, and she was betting that someone would not be me. She was wrong about that. The certified letter went to the HOA board. The response came from a law firm in Houston that had the kind of letterhead designed to communicate that the people on the other side of this dispute had resources. The letter cited prescriptive easement theory and referenced continuous use and community reliance and other phrases that lawyers deploy when they want to make a property dispute seem more complicated than it is. I drove to the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning and spent 4 hours in the records room. The smell in there is particular, old paper, institutional cleaner, and the specific dust of documents that have not been touched since they were filed. What I found was not complicated. My grandfather's deed, my father's subsequent survey correction filed in 1986. Every document in the file said the same thing in the unambiguous language of property law. This land belongs to the Denton family. It has never been public. It has never been conveyed to any other party. There is no easement, prescriptive or otherwise, that survives contact with the actual recorded title. I also found something else while I was there. Something that a county records clerk named Dorothy, who had known my family since before I was born, mentioned while she was helping me locate the 1947 plat. She said, "You know that HOA Development had a formation agreement. Might want to look at Section 11. Section 11 of the Creekwood Ranch Estates Development Agreement filed with the county before the first foundation was poured included a clause in which the developer explicitly acknowledged that pre-existing private ranch roads within proximity of the development carried no community access rights and that the HOA made no representations to buyers about access to any such roads. Sandra had been selling something the HOA had already legally disclaimed. I called my attorney that afternoon. Her name is Patricia Holloway, and she practices property rights law in a way that makes opposing counsel nervous. I explained what I had found. She asked me to scan and send everything. 3 hours later, she called me back. "Cole," she said, "she's been telling buyers your road is included in their amenities. She has pending sales contracts with that representation in the documents." I asked how she knew that. Patricia said she had a source in the area real estate community who found the situation ethically troubling enough to share what she knew. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I asked Patricia what we could do. She said, "The question is what you want. You can pursue damages, you can seek injunctive relief, or you can build a wall." She paused. "Or all three." I told her I was going to start with the wall. Hector Vega has been building things in this county since he was following his father around job sites in middle school. He is 53 years old, has the particular calm of someone who has solved every construction problem imaginable, and chews spearmint gum in a way that communicates steady concentration. I have known him since we were both young men, and I trust his work the way I trust anything that has been proven over time. I described what I wanted. Not a fence, not a gate replacement, a barrier. Steel-reinforced concrete, foundation deep enough to be geological, height sufficient to make the statement I wanted to make without any ambiguity about the nature of the statement. Hector looked at the site for about 2 minutes without speaking. Then he pulled out a notepad and started writing specifications with the focused attention of someone who takes the problem seriously. 12 feet of concrete wall, he said. 8-inch reinforced construction with a rebar grid engineered to commercial load-bearing standards. Foundation 4 feet deep into caliche. Angled cap on top to discourage climbing. Integrated electronic gate with solar backup, motion cameras with cloud storage, keypad entry with rotating access codes. Agricultural security improvement under Texas Rural Property Code. Permitted, inspectable, permanent. He gave me a number that made my checking account have an opinion. $49,000 for materials, labor, permits, and electronics. I had been saving money in a fund I had mentally labeled the Sandra problem since approximately month 2 of the trespassing. The fund covered it. I asked when he could start. He said Monday. I said good. The permits took 3 days. Every stamp was a small satisfaction. Legal construction, properly authorized, documented through official channels, unassailable in court. My grandfather had taught me something about this. Do the thing right the first time and you never have to apologize for it later. Sandra arrived 15 minutes after Hector's crew on Monday morning. I will give her this: she had good surveillance on my property, which would become relevant later in the criminal proceedings. She came with 3 women from the HOA board, all of them dressed in the way that communicates suburban authority, and a man in a hard hat who turned out to be a county inspector she had personally contacted and requested perform an emergency review of the construction. I watched them approach from the house and felt nothing in particular except the quiet satisfaction of knowing that my permit folder was in my hand and had been reviewed by an attorney. The inspector, whose name was Rodriguez, examined our paperwork with the expression of a man who has been used as an instrument in a neighbor dispute before and does not find the experience enjoyable. He checked measurements. He reviewed the permit documentation. He tested the soil assessment against our foundation depth specification. He said, "Everything appears to be in compliance. Setbacks are correct. Foundation specifications exceed agricultural standards." Sandra said, "That can't be right." Rodriguez said it was, in the tone of a man who had just confirmed it personally and did not require input on the subject. He left. Sandra and her committee stood in my pasture looking at the beginning of a wall that was going to outlast all of us, and I watched them calculate the implications of what they were seeing. Then I said, "You're trespassing. I'd appreciate it if you'd move back to the county road." They left. Not immediately, but they left. The sabotage happened on a Tuesday night. My security cameras recorded it clearly, a figure in dark clothes with a crowbar working on the foundation forms at approximately 2 a.m, with the expertise of someone who had watched a construction tutorial but had never actually poured concrete. The structural damage was targeted incorrectly, which is the kind of mistake an amateur makes when they understand that damage should be done but don't understand where the load points are. Deputy Torres arrived at 6 a.m. after I called. He reviewed the footage, wrote down the license plate visible on a vehicle parked on the county road shoulder in the camera's peripheral range, and told me what I already knew. The footage was good enough for an investigation, but the figure's face wasn't clearly captured. I told him I understood and asked him to file the report. He filed it. The report would become relevant in month 4. The construction continued. Concrete poured on schedule. The wall rose with the particular authority of something that has been properly engineered. Each day it was taller. Each day Sandra's options narrowed. The financial reality underneath Sandra's behavior came through my attorney's contact in the local real estate community. Sandra had approved an HOA budget the previous year that included $160,000 in community improvements, designer landscaping, decorative lighting, amenity upgrades that the dues structure could not support without significant property value appreciation. She needed the properties she was selling to close at premium prices. The ranch access marketing angle, authentic Texas ranch living with private road privileges, was not incidental to her business plan. It was central to it. Without it, her pending contracts were misrepresented sales and her budget projections were fiction. She had committed to a financial structure that required stealing my property to remain solvent. That context made everything that followed make more sense. The environmental complaints were creative, I will say that. Sandra filed reports with the State Agricultural Commission claiming my cattle operation was creating health hazards and contaminating local water sources. She filed noise complaints citing unreasonable agricultural disturbance. She filed with the county health department about what she described as sanitation concerns. Each complaint brought an inspector. Each inspector found a clean, well-managed operation. The veterinarian who arrived on behalf of the Agricultural Commission spent 40 minutes examining my herd and told me it was one of the better managed operations she had seen in the region. She also told me, in a tone that conveyed professional irritation, that filing false reports with state agricultural agencies carried penalties she was required to document. I thanked her and kept her report. The collection of official documents I was accumulating had the satisfying quality of a case building itself. Sandra was generating evidence of her own conduct with every complaint she filed, every contractor she sent to my property, every trespassing incident my cameras recorded. Patricia reviewed the growing file with the appreciation of an attorney watching a gift assemble itself. The buyers began figuring things out around week 3 of construction. The wall was visible. The news coverage was running. The county deed records were public. 3 families who had signed contracts with access to my property as a listed amenity contacted Patricia through their own attorneys seeking clarification about whether that access was legitimate. It was not. 2 contracts canceled. One initiated fraud proceedings against Sandra directly. The transactions Sandra had been counting on to cover her budget deficit dissolved over the course of a week, like everything built on a false premise eventually does. The attempt to stop construction through an eminent domain inquiry was the most ambitious of Sandra's strategies, and the one that collapsed most completely. She contacted the county commissioner's office, arguing that the road served emergency vehicle access needs that justified government intervention. Commissioner Caldwell, who had attended my father's funeral and whose family had ranched this county for as long as mine had, explained to Sandra that eminent domain was a government power that required demonstrated public necessity, that private hoe roads were not public infrastructure, and that my property had never been identified in any county emergency access plan. He did this in approximately 4 minutes and did not follow up. The channel news coverage Sandra arranged backfired in the specific way that things backfire when the evidence is on the other side. She had invited a television crew to film what she was framing as a concerned community member being blocked from emergency access by a selfish property owner. The framing required that the audience not see the permits, the deed records, the attorney's documentation of her fraudulent sales representations, or the footage of her driving through my gate at 30 miles an hour while my pregnant cattle scattered in panic. Patricia made sure the crew saw all of it. The story that ran was not the story Sandra had called them for. It was a different story, about a real estate agent who had been selling access to property she did not own, whose license history showed prior disciplinary action for a similar scheme in 2018, and who was now under investigation by the Texas Real Estate Commission for fraudulent misrepresentation to buyers. The Trek investigator appeared at the Clearwater County Fair on the same Saturday Sandra had apparently chosen to make a public stand at the community event. The timing was either coincidence or her own poor planning. He announced the suspension of her license with the minimal ceremony of an official performing a professional function. The cameras were rolling. The crowd was watching. Sandra was standing in front of a 12-foot concrete wall that she had tried for 3 months to prevent, and that was now a finished, permitted, permanent fact. Deputy Torres appeared from the crowd with paperwork that had taken 6 weeks to become complete enough to use. The charges were criminal trespass, property damage, fraudulent misrepresentation, and filing false governmental reports. Each count documented with security camera footage, official complaint records, or testimony from buyers who had been told things that were not true. Sandra said things as she was walked to the patrol car that I will not repeat here. They were captured on camera and broadcast on the evening news. They were not the words of someone who had learned anything from the experience. I stood next to my wall and looked at it. 12 feet of reinforced concrete that Hector had built to a standard that would survive whatever the next 100 years of Texas weather produced. The electronic gate controlled by a system that logged every authorized entry and had logged 0 unauthorized entries since the day it was installed. $49,000. It was the most considered expenditure I have made since buying my first bull. The resolution took the shape that these things take when the documentation is thorough and the wrongdoing is clear. Sandra's guilty plea covered criminal trespass, property damage, and filing false reports. 20 months probation. $32,000 in restitution. Permanent restraining order establishing a boundary distance that made my gate irrelevant to her daily life even if she had wanted to test it. The civil proceedings from the defrauded buyers produced judgments that required the sale of her house. The house sold below market because the circumstances of the sale were widely known in a county where information travels the same way it has always traveled, through people who have known each other for decades and share what they know with the people they trust. She relocated to Dallas. That is the last information I have about her. The HOA elected new leadership that fall. The new president, a retired school administrator named James, came to my property with a formal written apology from the board, which I accepted, and a request to establish a good neighbor framework for the relationship between the development and the adjacent ranch properties, which I agreed to discuss. We have had 3 meetings since then. Loretta comes to the meetings. She has a teacher's ability to move people from defensive postures to productive ones, and the conversations have been genuinely useful. The development and the ranch are neighbors. That is a permanent fact of geography. What isn't permanent is whether that proximity produces conflict or cooperation, and the choice belongs to the people involved. Hector's company has built 4 similar structures for other rural landowners in the county since completing mine. He calls the design the Denton configuration and uses our wall as his reference project when potential clients ask about specifications. I do not mind. The wall should be documented somewhere. My grandfather documented everything he built. The scholarship fund that Patricia and I established with a portion of the restitution payment supports rural students pursuing agricultural or legal education. 3 students received awards in the first year. One of them is studying property rights law specifically, which I find appropriate. Loretta and I have our coffee on the porch each morning when the weather allows. The gate is visible from the porch at the right angle. The cameras blink their small green lights. The wall stands in the morning light looking exactly like what it is, something built right, built to last, built for a specific purpose by people who understood the problem clearly. My father used to say that a well-built fence tells its own story. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to defend it. You just maintain it. I drive the property line on Sunday mornings the way he did. Check the fence. Check the gate. Check the wall. Everything's solid. Everything where it should be. The pecan trees on the northeast corner are putting out leaves again this spring. I walked up there last Sunday and stood for a while in the way I do. I told my grandfather about the wall, about the $49,000, about the contractor and the permits and the concrete. He would have wanted the measurements. Leave your story in the comments, the moment someone mistook your patience for permission, the neighbor dispute that taught you something permanent about property rights, the decision you made that cost money but bought peace. I read every one. Subscribe. Stay with it. The gate is closed. It will stay that way.